In the aftermath of World War II, America was a nation of immense power and optimism. The great industrial engine that had built tanks and bombs was now being retooled for peace. It was a time for turning swords into plowshares. And one of the greatest symbols of this transformation was a chemical compound called ammonium nitrate. Once the core ingredient of explosives that devastated cities, it was now being shipped by the ton to a recovering Europe, repurposed as a miracle fertilizer to help farmers grow crops and feed a hungry continent. It was a story of creation, of nurturing, of life. But on a clear spring morning in a bustling Texas port town, that promise of life would be transformed into an instrument of death on a scale America had never seen before. This is the story of a routine shipment of fertilizer, and the single, careless spark that ignited a chain reaction of explosions so powerful it would register on seismographs as an earthquake. It is the story of the day a city was nearly erased from the map. Before we witness one of America's most forgotten catastrophes, we invite you to answer a question in the comments. What is the true cost of progress when safety is overlooked? Act 1. The ticking time bomb. To understand the catastrophic explosion that would claim over 580 lives and fundamentally change American industrial safety regulations forever, you must first understand the world that created the conditions for such a disaster. This was not simply a story of industrial accident, but a complex tale of post-war transformation, chemical ignorance, and regulatory negligence that would culminate in one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. Our story begins in Texas City, Texas, in the spring of 1947, but the roots of the tragedy stretch back to the closing days of World War II and the massive industrial transformation that followed America's victory over fascism. The war had created the largest military-industrial complex in human history, with unprecedented production of explosives, chemicals, and war materials that had helped secure Allied victory on two fronts. Texas City in 1947 was the very embodiment of post-war American prosperity and industrial might. Located on Galveston Bay, just 40 miles southeast of Houston, this thriving port city had grown from a small railroad terminus into one of the most important petrochemical centers in the United States. The town's strategic location on the Gulf Coast made it an ideal hub for the oil and chemical industries that were fueling America's economic boom. The city's skyline was dominated by the imposing metallic skeletons of oil refineries, chemical plants, and storage facilities that operated around the clock, transforming crude petroleum into the gasoline, plastics, and chemicals that were revolutionizing American life. The massive Monsanto Chemical Plant, with its towering smokestacks and complex network of pipes and towers, was the crown jewel of the industrial district, employing hundreds of workers and producing chemicals that were essential to American industry and agriculture. By 1947, Texas City had grown to a population of nearly 20,000 residents, most of whom worked in the petroleum and chemical industries or in the busy port facilities that served as a gateway for American exports to the world. The community was proud, hardworking, and optimistic about the future, embodying the can-do spirit that had helped America emerge victorious from the greatest war in human history. However, the rapid and largely unregulated growth that had transformed Texas City from a small town into a major industrial center had also created dangerous conditions that few people understood or recognized. The concentration of petroleum refineries, chemical plants, and storage facilities in such a small area had created what safety experts would later recognize as a disaster waiting to happen, a city literally sitting on a powder keg. The chemical industry in the 1940s operated with minimal safety regulations and limited understanding of the long-term health and safety risks associated with many of the substances they were producing and transporting. Environmental protection laws did not exist, workplace safety standards were minimal, and the transportation of hazardous materials was governed by regulations that would be considered woefully inadequate by modern standards. This regulatory environment had been shaped by the urgent demands of wartime production, when speed and efficiency were considered more important than safety precautions, and by the post-war optimism that celebrated industrial progress without adequately considering its potential dangers. The same attitudes that had enabled American industry to outproduce the Axis powers were now being applied to peacetime production, often with catastrophic results. The specific substance that would trigger the Texas City disaster was ammonium nitrate, a chemical compound that perfectly embodied both the promise and the peril of America's post-war industrial transformation. During World War II, ammonium nitrate had been one of the most important raw materials in the American war effort, serving as a key ingredient in the explosives that had been used to destroy enemy targets throughout Europe and the Pacific. American chemical plants had produced millions of tons of ammonium nitrate during the war, and the manufacturing process had been perfected to produce large quantities of high-quality explosive material with maximum efficiency. The compound was relatively inexpensive to produce, could be manufactured using readily available raw materials, and was stable enough to transport and store safely under normal conditions. However, the end of the war had left American chemical companies with enormous production capacity for ammonium nitrate and limited military demand for explosive materials. Rather than shutting down these profitable manufacturing operations, the companies had sought new markets for their products, and they had found the perfect solution in the agricultural sector, where ammonium nitrate could be used as a highly effective nitrogen-based fertilizer. The transformation of ammonium nitrate from a weapon of war to an instrument of peace seemed to perfectly symbolize America's transition from wartime to peacetime production. The same chemical compound that had helped destroy Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would now help European farmers feed their war-ravaged populations and rebuild their agricultural economies. This transformation was also driven by geopolitical considerations, as the United States sought to prevent famine and political instability in Europe through massive food aid programs. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, would eventually provide more than $12 billion in economic assistance to European countries, much of it in the form of agricultural products and the materials needed to increase agricultural production. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer was seen as an essential component of this aid effort, as it could dramatically increase crop yields and help European farmers restore their damaged agricultural systems. American chemical companies were eager to participate in this lucrative export market, and the federal government encouraged these exports as part of its broader foreign policy objectives. However, the conversion of ammonium nitrate from military to civilian use had been accomplished with minimal attention to the safety implications of transporting and storing large quantities of this potentially dangerous material in civilian settings. The compound that had been carefully handled and stored under military supervision during the war was now being treated as a routine agricultural product that could be shipped and stored using conventional methods. The fundamental problem was that ammonium nitrate, while relatively stable under normal conditions, could become extremely dangerous when subjected to heat, pressure, or contamination with other chemicals. Under the right conditions, the fertilizer could explode with tremendous force, creating blast effects similar to military explosives but on an even larger scale because of the quantities involved. This danger had been recognized by some chemists and safety experts, but their warnings had been largely ignored by an industry that was focused on profits and efficiency rather than safety precautions. The regulatory agencies that might have imposed stricter safety standards were either unaware of the risks or unwilling to impose regulations that might interfere with profitable export operations. On April 11, 1947, a French-owned Liberty ship named the SS Grandcamp docked at Pier O in the Texas City port, beginning a loading operation that would culminate in disaster 5 days later. The Grandcamp was a veteran of World War II, originally christened the SS Benjamin or Curtis when it was launched in Los Angeles in 1942. The ship was a typical Liberty ship, one of the 2,700 mass-produced cargo vessels that had been built during World War II to replace merchant ships sunk by German submarines. Liberty ships were not elegant or particularly well-built vessels, but they were functional, reliable, and capable of carrying large quantities of cargo across long distances under dangerous conditions. After the war, the SS Benjamin or Curtis had been transferred to French ownership as part of America's effort to help its allies rebuild their merchant fleets and restore their international trade capabilities. Renamed the SS Grandcamp after the Normandy beach where Allied forces had landed on D-Day, the ship had been converted from military to civilian use and was now engaged in the peaceful work of transatlantic commerce. The Grandcamp's mission in Texas City was to load 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer that would be shipped to French farmers who were struggling to restore their war-damaged agricultural systems. This was exactly the kind of peaceful, constructive enterprise that American political leaders hoped would characterize the post-war world. American industry helping European recovery through beneficial trade relationships. However, the cargo that the Grandcamp was preparing to load was far more dangerous than anyone involved in the operation understood. The ammonium nitrate fertilizer had been manufactured in U.S. Army ordnance plants in Iowa and Nebraska under wartime conditions that prioritized speed and efficiency over safety considerations. The manufacturing process involved heating ammonium nitrate to high temperatures and mixing it with rosin and other additives to prevent caking during storage and transportation. However, this process created conditions that made the fertilizer more unstable and potentially more explosive than pure ammonium nitrate, though this increased danger was not well understood at the time. The fertilizer was packaged in paper bags weighing 100 pounds each, a packaging method that was convenient for handling and loading but provided minimal protection against moisture, contamination, or physical damage during transportation. Modern safety regulations would require such dangerous materials to be transported in specially designed containers with multiple safety features. But in 1947, such precautions were considered unnecessary for what was viewed as routine agricultural cargo. The loading operation that began on April 11th was supervised by longshoremen who had no special training in handling dangerous materials and no understanding of the potential risks associated with ammonium nitrate. The workers followed standard procedures for loading bulk cargo, using conventional equipment and methods that had been developed for handling grain, cotton, and other traditional agricultural products. The longshoremen who loaded the Grandcamp were experienced professionals who took pride in their ability to handle difficult and dangerous cargo under challenging conditions. They were members of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which had fought hard to improve working conditions and safety standards in the port industry, but their efforts had been focused on conventional workplace hazards rather than the specialized dangers associated with chemical cargo. During the 5-day loading operation, several potentially dangerous conditions developed that should have been recognized as warning signs of impending disaster. Bags of ammonium nitrate were torn or damaged during handling, spilling the granular white substance across the floor of the cargo hold. The spillage created dust clouds that reduced visibility and made the work environment more hazardous. More seriously, many of the workers were smoking cigarettes while they worked, despite posted no smoking signs and general regulations prohibiting smoking in cargo areas. This violation of safety procedures was common on many ships and docks, where regulations were often ignored or poorly enforced, but it created conditions where a single spark could trigger a catastrophic explosion. The ship's officers and the port authorities who supervised the loading operation were aware of these safety violations but chose not to enforce the regulations strictly, apparently believing that the risks were minimal and that stopping work to address every minor violation would be unnecessarily disruptive to the loading schedule. This attitude reflected the general approach to industrial safety that prevailed in the 1940s, when economic efficiency was considered more important than strict adherence to safety procedures, and when the potential consequences of industrial accidents were often underestimated or ignored entirely. As the loading operation continued, the ammonium nitrate was packed deeper and deeper into the ship's cargo holds, creating a dense, tightly packed mass of explosive material that would prove to be far more dangerous than anyone realized. The 2,300 tons of fertilizer represented one of the largest concentrations of ammonium nitrate ever assembled in a civilian setting, creating explosive potential equivalent to hundreds of tons of military-grade explosives. The concentration of so much dangerous material in such a confined space, combined with the unsafe handling practices and the general lack of awareness about the risks involved, had created a situation that was inherently unstable and potentially catastrophic. The stage was set for a disaster that would shake the industrial world and force a fundamental reconsideration of safety practices in the chemical industry. However, the workers and officials involved in the loading operation remained blissfully unaware of the danger they were creating. They viewed their work as routine cargo handling, similar to loading thousands of other ships that had passed through Texas City without incident. The ammonium nitrate fertilizer was seen as a beneficial product that would help European farmers feed their families and rebuild their war-torn economies. This optimistic view would persist until the morning of April 16, 1947, when a small fire in the cargo hold would trigger a chain reaction that would transform the peaceful port city into the scene of one of the most devastating industrial disasters in American history. The fuse was about to be lit on a bomb that no one knew existed, and the explosion would change forever the way Americans thought about industrial safety and government responsibility. The morning of April 16, 1947, dawned clear and cool in Texas City, with temperatures around 56 degrees Fahrenheit and a brisk 20-mile-per-hour wind from the north-northwest. It was the kind of pleasant spring morning that made residents grateful to live in a prosperous community where the future seemed bright and full of promise. At approximately 8 a.m., longshoremen arrived at the docks to continue the loading operation on the SS Grandcamp, which had been proceeding without incident for 5 days. The workers removed the hatch covers from cargo hold number 4 to continue loading the remaining bags of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, unaware that they were about to witness the beginning of a disaster that would claim hundreds of lives and devastate their community. As the workers descended into the cargo hold and began preparing for another day of routine loading work, one of them noticed something unusual, a wisp of smoke rising from somewhere deep within the packed bags of fertilizer. At first, this seemed like nothing more than an annoyance, a small fire that could be quickly extinguished so that work could continue without significant delay. However, this small wisp of smoke was actually the visible sign that a catastrophic chain reaction had already begun within the tightly packed mass of ammonium nitrate. The chemical processes that would lead to the destruction of the ship and the devastation of Texas City were already underway, though no one involved understood the true nature or magnitude of the danger they were facing. The initial response to the fire was not panic but routine annoyance, reflecting the general attitude that fires on ships and docks were common occurrences that could be handled through standard firefighting procedures. Ship fires were indeed a frequent problem in busy ports, where smoking materials, electrical equipment, and other ignition sources created constant fire hazards that were typically managed without major incident. The crew of the Grandcamp attempted to extinguish the fire using the conventional methods available to them, beginning with buckets of water and fire extinguishers that were standard equipment on merchant vessels. However, these initial efforts proved ineffective, and the smoke continued to rise from within the cargo hold, indicating that the fire was spreading rather than being contained. At this point, Captain Charles de Gillibon made a decision that would prove to be fatal for him and hundreds of other people. Fearing that using water from fire hoses would ruin the valuable cargo of fertilizer, worth approximately $500, he ordered his crew to fight the fire using steam instead of water, a standard procedure for fighting fires in enclosed spaces where water damage was a concern. The decision to use steam rather than water was based on established maritime firefighting procedures and was considered a reasonable response to the situation as the captain understood it. Steam firefighting was commonly used to extinguish fires in cargo holds, oil tankers, and other confined spaces where water might cause damage to cargo or create additional hazards. However, Captain de Gillibon did not understand that ammonium nitrate was not a standard substance and that the use of steam would create conditions that would make an explosion more likely rather than less likely. The steam suppressed the visible flames but also superheated the chemical, raising the pressure inside the hold to catastrophic levels and creating the exact conditions needed to trigger a massive explosion. As the steam was piped into the sealed cargo hold, the SS Grandcamp was transformed from a cargo ship into a floating bomb, with more than 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate being heated and pressurized in a confined space that would eventually rupture with devastating force. The ship had become a colossal pressure cooker that was building toward an explosion that would be heard more than 150 miles away. The scene on the shore began to take on an increasingly ominous character as bright orange smoke began billowing from the ship's hatches, creating a spectacular and unusual sight that attracted the attention of people throughout Texas City. The orange color of the smoke was unlike anything that local residents had ever seen before, and it created a beautiful but eerie spectacle that drew hundreds of onlookers to the waterfront. Among the spectators who gathered to watch the unusual fire were many schoolchildren who had been dismissed from their classes or who were on their way to school when they noticed the colorful smoke rising from the harbor. Teachers and parents, equally curious about the strange sight, joined the growing crowd of onlookers who lined the docks and nearby streets to observe what they believed was simply an interesting but harmless ship fire. As the situation aboard the Grandcamp continued to deteriorate, the ship itself began to glow with heat, and the water around its hull literally began to boil from the intense temperatures being generated within the cargo hold. These visible signs should have been recognized as indicators of extreme danger, but the spectators, including many children, remained close to what would soon become ground zero of an unprecedented disaster. At 9 a.m., as the situation aboard the Grandcamp became increasingly critical, someone finally called the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department to request assistance with what was still believed to be a routine ship fire. The call triggered a response by 28 brave men led by Fire Chief Henry Baumgartner, professional firefighters who had dedicated their lives to protecting their community from exactly this kind of emergency. The Texas City Volunteer Fire Department was a small but dedicated organization that served a community of nearly 20,000 residents with limited resources but unlimited courage. The volunteer firefighters were respected members of the community who had undergone extensive training and who took pride in their ability to respond quickly and effectively to emergencies throughout the city and surrounding areas. Chief Henry Baumgartner was a veteran firefighter who had led the department for several years and who was known throughout Texas City for his competence, courage, and dedication to public safety. He had fought hundreds of fires during his career and had seen every kind of emergency that a busy port city could produce, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to encounter aboard the SS Grandcamp. The 28 firefighters who responded to the call represented the entire active membership of the volunteer department, and they brought with them all 4 of the fire trucks that comprised the city's firefighting capability. They were brave, dedicated men who were prepared to risk their lives to save others, but they were equipped and trained to handle house fires, car accidents, and conventional emergencies rather than the kind of massive industrial disaster that was about to unfold. As the fire department raced through the streets of Texas City toward the harbor, the men had no idea that they were driving toward their deaths. They believed they were responding to a routine ship fire that could be extinguished using conventional firefighting methods, and they had no training or equipment that would have enabled them to recognize or respond appropriately to the unprecedented danger that awaited them at the docks. The firefighters arrived at the waterfront and immediately began setting up their equipment to fight what they believed was a conventional ship fire. They uncoiled their hoses, connected them to water sources, and prepared to direct streams of water onto the burning vessel, following procedures that had been successful in hundreds of similar situations. However, The fire aboard the SS Grandcamp was not a conventional ship fire, and the standard firefighting procedures that had served the department well in the past were not only ineffective but actually dangerous in this unprecedented situation. The firefighters were attempting to fight a fire that could not be fought, using methods that were inadequate for dealing with the massive chemical explosion that was building toward an inevitable and catastrophic climax. As Chief Baumgartner and his men worked desperately to control the situation, they were unaware that they had become part of a countdown to disaster that could no longer be stopped. The chemical processes occurring within the cargo hold of the Grandcamp had reached a point of no return, and the explosion that would destroy the ship and kill hundreds of people was now only minutes away. The stage was set for one of the most devastating industrial disasters in American history, and the heroes of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department were about to make the ultimate sacrifice in their attempt to protect a community that they had served faithfully for years. They would die as they had lived, courageously facing danger in the service of others, unaware that their sacrifice would help bring about fundamental changes in industrial safety practices that would protect countless future generations. Act 2: The Day the Earth Shook. At precisely 9:12 a.m. on April 16, 1947, the mounting pressure and heat inside cargo hold number 4 of the SS Grandcamp reached the critical threshold that transformed 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer into one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in human history. The moment that changed forever the lives of thousands of people and the landscape of industrial safety in America lasted only seconds, but its consequences would reverberate for decades. The explosion was an event of almost unimaginable violence that exceeded anything in the previous experience of industrial disaster. The entire SS Grandcamp, a 7,000-ton Liberty ship that had survived the dangerous Atlantic crossings of World War II, was instantly disintegrated by forces that turned steel and concrete into deadly projectiles and reduced human beings to vapor in the blink of an eye. The initial flash of the explosion was described by witnesses as brighter than the sun, a brilliant white light that temporarily blinded anyone who was looking in the direction of the ship when the detonation occurred. This was followed immediately by a deafening roar that was heard as far as 150 miles away in Louisiana and that registered on seismographs in Denver, Colorado, nearly 1,000 miles from the explosion site. The blast created a massive mushroom cloud that rose more than 2,000 feet into the clear morning sky, filled with the black smoke of burning oil and chemicals that created an ominous tower of destruction visible for many miles around Texas City. The cloud was reminiscent of the atomic bomb explosions that had ended World War II, and it served as a terrifying reminder that the forces unleashed by modern industrial processes could rival those of nuclear weapons. The power of the explosion was demonstrated by the fate of the ship's 1.5-ton anchor, which was launched nearly 2 miles through the air before embedding itself 10 feet deep in the ground at the Pan American refinery. Other pieces of the ship, some weighing several tons, were scattered across the city and surrounding countryside, creating a deadly rain of metal that continued for several minutes after the initial blast. 2 small sightseeing planes that had been circling the burning ship to observe the unusual orange smoke were swatted from the sky like insects, their pilots and passengers killed instantly when the shock wave struck their aircraft. The planes crashed into Galveston Bay, adding to the death toll and demonstrating that the explosion's effects extended far beyond the immediate area around the docks. On the ground, the effect was nothing short of apocalyptic. The shock wave traveled outward from the explosion at nearly the speed of sound, creating a wall of compressed air that flattened buildings, shattered windows, and killed or injured anyone caught in its path. The blast leveled nearly 1,000 buildings in the immediate vicinity of the port, reducing entire city blocks to rubble and debris. The force of the explosion was so great that it shattered windows in Houston, 40 miles away, and was felt by people as far as 150 miles distant in Louisiana. Buildings swayed in cities throughout southeastern Texas, and the shock was recorded by sensitive instruments throughout the region, confirming that this was an event of unprecedented magnitude in the history of American industrial accidents. The explosion also created a 15-foot tidal wave that surged inland from the harbor, sweeping buildings, vehicles, and people before it as it carried the destructive force of the blast far beyond the immediate explosion site. The wave swept away everything in its path, including massive steel barges that were carried hundreds of feet inland before the waters receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud, debris, and destruction. The Monsanto Chemical Plant, located just 300 feet from the SS Grandcamp's berth, bore the full brunt of the explosion's force. The massive industrial complex, which had been one of the largest chemical manufacturing facilities in the United States, was completely obliterated in seconds, its buildings, equipment, and storage tanks reduced to twisted metal and scattered debris. At the time of the explosion, more than 450 workers were beginning their morning shift at the Monsanto plant, and most of them were killed instantly when the blast wave struck the facility. The death toll at Monsanto alone exceeded 150 people, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history, even without considering the casualties elsewhere in the city. The workers who died at Monsanto included chemists, engineers, maintenance technicians, security guards, and office workers who had been going about their normal daily routines when the explosion occurred. Many of them were family men who had been looking forward to payday and weekend plans with their wives and children, but who instead became victims of a disaster that no one could have anticipated or prevented. Among the most tragic casualties of the disaster were the 28 members of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department who had responded to the initial fire call and who were attempting to fight the blaze aboard the Grandcamp when the explosion occurred. These brave men, led by Chief Henry Baumgartner, were vaporized by the blast, leaving nothing behind but fragments of their equipment and the memory of their heroic sacrifice. The loss of the entire fire department in a single moment was devastating, not only because of the personal tragedies involved, but also because it left Texas City without any organized firefighting capability at the very moment when fires were breaking out throughout the city. The men who had dedicated their lives to protecting their community from exactly this kind of disaster had become its first and most heroic victims. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was a scene that witnesses compared to the destruction of European cities during World War II or to depictions of hell from religious texts. Dazed and wounded survivors stumbled through streets littered with glass, metal, and debris, many of them covered with blood and suffering from injuries that ranged from cuts and bruises to massive trauma that would prove fatal. The air was filled with the toxic chemical haze created by the explosion of the Monsanto plant and the rupture of numerous storage tanks and pipelines that contained petroleum products and industrial chemicals. This toxic cloud made breathing difficult and dangerous for survivors and rescue workers, creating additional health hazards that compounded the immediate dangers created by the explosion itself. The blast had ruptured oil storage tanks and chemical pipelines throughout the waterfront industrial district, creating conditions for massive fires that began breaking out within minutes of the explosion. These fires spread rapidly through the petroleum and chemical facilities that lined the harbor, creating a wall of flame that swept through the port area and threatened to engulf the entire industrial district. The fires created additional dangers for survivors who were trapped in damaged buildings or who were attempting to flee the disaster area. Many people who had survived the initial explosion were killed or injured by the fires that followed, and the combination of blast damage and fire damage made rescue operations extremely difficult and dangerous. However, the horror was far from over. The initial explosion had set fire to several other ships in the harbor, including the SS High Flyer, which was moored in an adjacent slip approximately 600 feet from where the Grandcamp had been docked. The High Flyer presented an even greater danger than the Grandcamp had, as it was loaded with 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate and 2,000 tons of sulfur, creating a potential second explosion that could be even more devastating than the first. The crew of the High Flyer, many of whom had been injured by debris from the Grandcamp explosion, struggled heroically to save their ship and prevent a second disaster. However, the intense heat from the nearby fires and the damage caused by flying debris from the first explosion made their task nearly impossible. The ship's anchor chains had been fused solid by the heat and blast effects of the first explosion, making it impossible to move the high flyer away from the burning waterfront area using conventional methods. Tugboats from Galveston were summoned to assist in moving the ship, but the dangerous conditions in the harbor made it difficult for rescue vessels to approach close enough to be effective. As the day wore on and the fires continued to spread throughout the port area, the high flyer burned steadily, creating an increasingly dangerous situation that threatened to produce a second explosion that could kill many of the rescue workers who were attempting to save survivors of the first blast. The ship became a floating time bomb that held an entire city hostage while rescue operations continued around it. The rescue efforts that began immediately after the first explosion were hampered by the destruction of the city's emergency services infrastructure and the dangerous conditions created by ongoing fires and the threat of additional explosions. With the fire department destroyed and the police force decimated by casualties, much of the initial rescue work was carried out by ordinary citizens who risked their lives to help their neighbors. The American Red Cross mobilized quickly to provide emergency assistance, establishing first aid stations, temporary morgues, and communication centers throughout the damaged areas of the city. Volunteers poured in from Houston, Galveston, and other nearby cities to assist with rescue operations, medical care, and the grim task of searching for bodies in the wreckage. Medical facilities in Texas City and the surrounding area were quickly overwhelmed by the number of casualties, which ultimately exceeded 5,000 injured people in addition to the more than 500 who were killed. Hospitals as far away as Houston were pressed into service to treat the wounded, and emergency medical stations were established in schools, churches, and other buildings that had survived the blast. The search for survivors and bodies was a heartbreaking and dangerous task that continued for weeks after the explosion. Many victims had been buried under tons of debris or had been carried away by the tidal wave that followed the blast, making identification difficult or impossible in many cases. The process of identifying victims was complicated by the fact that many bodies had been mutilated beyond recognition by the blast effects or by the fires that followed the explosion. In many cases, identification had to be made through personal effects, dental records, or other indirect evidence, and some victims were never identified at all. For 16 agonizing hours after the first explosion, the people of Texas City lived in fear that the burning SS High Flyer would explode and create additional devastation in a community that had already suffered unprecedented losses. Rescue workers continued their dangerous work while constantly aware that a second explosion could occur at any moment. As night fell on April 16, 1947, the High Flyer continued to burn, and the situation became increasingly critical. Attempts to move the ship or to extinguish the fires aboard it had proven unsuccessful, and it became clear that a second explosion was inevitable. The only question was when it would occur and how many additional lives it would claim. At 1:10 a.m. on the morning of April 17, 1947, the SS High Flyer finally exploded, sending a new shock wave through the devastated city and creating additional destruction in areas that had already been damaged by the first blast. The second explosion was witnessed by fewer people than the first, but those who saw it reported that it seemed even more powerful and spectacular than the Grandcamp explosion had been. The High Flyer explosion destroyed the nearby SS Wilson B. Keene, another cargo ship that had been damaged in the first blast, and created additional fires and damage throughout the port area. At least 2 more people were killed by the second explosion, and numerous rescue workers and survivors were injured by flying debris and the effects of the blast wave. The destruction of the High Flyer marked the end of the immediate explosive threat, but it also compounded the devastation and made the overall disaster even more catastrophic. The port area was now completely destroyed, with multiple ships sunk or destroyed, numerous industrial facilities in ruins, and fires continuing to burn throughout the waterfront district. When dawn broke on April 17, 1947, Texas City presented a scene of devastation that defied comprehension. The vibrant, optimistic industrial community that had greeted the morning of April 16th with hope and confidence was gone, replaced by a blackened, smoking wasteland that looked more like a battlefield from World War II than an American city. The fires that had been ignited by the explosions continued to burn for days, fed by ruptured petroleum pipelines and damaged storage facilities that contained thousands of gallons of flammable liquids. The smoke from these fires was visible for miles and served as a grim reminder of the disaster that had befallen the community. The human cost of the disaster was staggering and would continue to mount as rescue workers searched through the debris for additional victims. The official death toll would eventually reach 581 people, but this figure was certainly an underestimate, as many victims were never found or identified, particularly among the population of transient workers and undocumented immigrants who had been employed in the port and industrial facilities. The economic cost was equally devastating, with property damage estimated at more than $67 million in 1947 dollars, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. Entire industrial facilities had been destroyed, hundreds of homes and businesses had been damaged or destroyed, and the port facilities that had been the economic foundation of the community were in ruins. But beyond the immediate human and economic costs, the Texas City disaster had created a crisis of confidence in American industrial safety practices and government regulatory oversight that would have far-reaching consequences for industrial policy, legal doctrine, and corporate responsibility. The explosion that had destroyed a Texas port city would ultimately change the way America thought about the relationship between industrial progress and public safety. The disaster had demonstrated that the post-war industrial boom carried with it unprecedented risks that were poorly understood and inadequately regulated. The same technological capabilities that had won World War II and were now driving American prosperity could also create dangers that threatened entire communities and that could overwhelm any conventional emergency response. As rescue workers continued their grim task of searching for survivors and bodies in the wreckage of Texas City, questions began to be raised about who was responsible for the disaster and whether it could have been prevented through better safety practices or more effective government regulation. These questions would eventually lead to legal battles that would reach the Supreme Court of the United States and would establish important precedents for government liability and corporate responsibility. The day the earth shook in Texas City was over, but the long process of rebuilding the community, caring for the survivors, and learning from the disaster was just beginning. The explosion that had lasted only seconds would have consequences that would continue for decades, transforming not only the lives of those who experienced it but also the industrial safety practices and legal frameworks that govern American commerce. Act 3: The Ashes and the Lawsuit. The immediate aftermath of the Texas City disaster was characterized by both remarkable heroism and devastating loss, as the community struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened and to begin the long process of recovery from one of the most catastrophic industrial accidents in American history. The human cost of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualties to encompass thousands of families whose lives had been forever changed by the events of April 16th and 17th, 1947. The official death toll of 581 people was almost certainly an underestimate of the true number of casualties, as many victims were never found or identified due to the complete destruction caused by the explosions. The blast effects and subsequent fires had been so intense that many victims had been vaporized or reduced to fragments that could not be identified using the forensic techniques available in 1947. The search for victims was a grim and heartbreaking task that continued for months after the disaster, with rescue workers and volunteers combing through millions of tons of debris, mud, and wreckage in search of human remains. Many bodies were found miles from the explosion site, having been carried by the tidal wave or thrown through the air by the force of the blast. The process of identifying victims was complicated by the fact that many of the dead had been so severely mutilated by the explosion that conventional identification methods were impossible. In many cases, identification had to be made through dental records, personal effects, or information provided by family members about what clothing the victim had been wearing or where they had been working when the explosion occurred. Among the most tragic aspects of the casualty count was the large number of victims who were never identified at all. These included many transient workers, seasonal laborers, and undocumented immigrants who had been employed in the port and industrial facilities but whose presence in Texas City had not been officially recorded. Their deaths went uncounted in the official statistics, and their families in Mexico and other countries were never notified of their fate. The injured survivors of the disaster faced their own challenges, as more than 5,000 people had been wounded by the explosions and fires, with injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to severe burns, traumatic amputations, and life-threatening internal injuries. The medical facilities in Texas City and the surrounding region were quickly overwhelmed by the number of casualties, and emergency treatment centers had to be established in schools, churches, and other buildings throughout the area. Many of the injured would suffer from their wounds for the rest of their lives, with permanent disabilities that prevented them from working or maintaining the quality of life they had enjoyed before the disaster. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors was equally severe, as many people developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder from witnessing the destruction of their community and the deaths of their friends and family members. The economic impact of the disaster was equally devastating, as the explosions had destroyed not only individual homes and businesses but also the industrial infrastructure that had provided employment for most of the community's residents. The Monsanto Chemical Plant, which had been one of the largest employers in the area, was completely destroyed, putting hundreds of people out of work and eliminating a major source of tax revenue for the city. The port facilities that had been the economic foundation of Texas City were in ruins, with docks, warehouses, and loading equipment destroyed or severely damaged by the explosions and fires. The petroleum refineries and chemical plants that had made the city a major industrial center were also heavily damaged, requiring months or years of reconstruction before they could resume operations. The total property damage was estimated at more than $67 million in 1947, a staggering sum that would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. This figure included not only the direct damage caused by the explosions but also the economic losses resulting from business interruption, lost wages, and reduced property values throughout the affected area. However, the response to the disaster also demonstrated the resilience and compassion of the American people as aid poured in from throughout the United States and around the world. The American Red Cross organized one of its largest disaster relief operations, providing emergency shelter, food, medical care, and financial assistance to thousands of families who had lost their homes and possessions. Volunteers from throughout Texas and neighboring states traveled to Texas City to assist with rescue operations, cleanup efforts, and the reconstruction of the community. Churches, civic organizations, labor unions, and individual citizens contributed millions of dollars to relief funds that helped survivors rebuild their lives and their community. The federal government also provided substantial assistance, with President Harry Truman declaring Texas City a federal disaster area and authorizing the use of military personnel and equipment to assist with rescue and cleanup operations. The Coast Guard, Navy, and Army Corps of Engineers all played important roles in the relief effort, providing specialized equipment and expertise that was essential for dealing with the scale and complexity of the disaster. But as the immediate crisis passed and the community began the long process of recovery, attention increasingly focused on the question of responsibility for the disaster and whether it could have been prevented through better safety practices or more effective government oversight. The investigation that followed would reveal a cascade of systemic failures that extended from the manufacturing plants where the ammonium nitrate had been produced to the regulatory agencies that were supposed to ensure the safety of such operations. The investigation revealed that the ammonium nitrate fertilizer aboard the SS Grandcamp had been manufactured under contract with the United States government at Army ordnance plants in Iowa and Nebraska. The production process had been designed during World War II to maximize the quantity and explosive power of ammonium nitrate for military use, with little consideration given to the safety implications of using the same processes to produce fertilizer for civilian use. The manufacturing specifications developed by the government had included several features that made the fertilizer more dangerous than necessary, including production at high temperatures that created unstable conditions and packaging in paper bags that provided minimal protection against moisture and contamination. Government officials had been aware of some of the potential dangers but had chosen to accept these risks in order to maximize production efficiency and minimize costs. More troubling was the revelation that the government had conducted limited safety testing of the fertilizer but had terminated these tests before they were completed, against the recommendations of the scientists who were conducting the research. The decision to halt the safety testing had been made for budgetary reasons and because officials believed that the risks were acceptable, but it meant that important safety information had never been developed or disseminated to those who handled the product. The regulatory framework governing the transportation and storage of ammonium nitrate was also found to be woefully inadequate, with minimal safety requirements and virtually no enforcement mechanisms. The Coast Guard and other agencies that were responsible for port safety had no specific regulations governing the handling of ammonium nitrate, and the general maritime safety regulations that did exist were not designed to deal with the unique hazards presented by large quantities of explosive materials. These revelations led to growing public anger and demands for accountability, as families who had lost loved ones and businesses that had been destroyed sought compensation for their losses. The legal system became the arena where questions of responsibility and compensation would be resolved, leading to one of the most significant legal battles in American history. The case that emerged from the Texas City disaster was unprecedented in both its scope and its legal implications. More than 8,000 individual claims totaling over $200 million were filed against the United States government under the recently passed Federal Tort Claims Act of 1946, which for the first time in American history had waived the government's sovereign immunity and allowed private parties to sue the federal government for damages caused by negligent acts. These lawsuits were eventually consolidated into a single massive class action case, Dale versus United States, which became the first major test of the Federal Tort Claims Act and one of the most important legal precedents in American tort law. The case was named after Henry G. Dale, a longshoreman who had been killed in the explosion, and it represented the interests of thousands of victims and their families who sought compensation for their losses. The plaintiffs argued that the United States government had been negligent at every stage of the process that led to the disaster, from the original decision to manufacture and export ammonium nitrate fertilizer to the specific manufacturing processes used to produce the material, to the inadequate safety testing and regulation of its transportation and storage. They contended that government officials had known or should have known about the dangers involved and had failed to take appropriate precautions to protect public safety. The legal team representing the plaintiffs included some of the most prominent trial lawyers in the United States, who worked for years to develop the complex factual and legal arguments needed to prove government liability in such an unprecedented case. They gathered testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including survivors of the explosion, family members of victims, government officials, and scientific experts who could explain the technical aspects of the disaster. The government's defense was based on the argument that the decisions leading to the disaster had been made by high-level officials as part of the nation's foreign policy objectives and were therefore protected by the discretionary function exception contained in the Federal Tort Claims Act. This exception was designed to prevent the courts from second-guessing policy decisions made by government officials, even when those decisions might have unfortunate consequences. The initial trial was conducted in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas, where Judge T. M. Kennedy heard testimony for more than a year before reaching his decision. The trial was one of the longest and most complex in American legal history up to that time, involving thousands of pages of testimony and hundreds of exhibits documenting every aspect of the disaster and its causes. In 1950, Judge Kennedy issued a landmark ruling finding the United States government liable for the disaster and awarding damages to the plaintiffs. The judge concluded that the government had been negligent in its manufacturing processes, its safety testing procedures, its packaging and labeling requirements, and its oversight of the loading and transportation of the ammonium nitrate fertilizer. The decision was hailed as a major victory for the victims and their families, and it seemed to establish the principle that the government could be held accountable for industrial disasters caused by its negligent actions. However, the government immediately appealed the decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, arguing that the district court had misinterpreted the Federal Tort Claims Act and had exceeded its authority in finding the government liable for policy decisions. The Court of Appeals upheld the district court's decision in 1951, confirming that the government had been negligent and that the victims were entitled to compensation for their losses. The appellate court's decision provided even stronger legal precedent for government liability in industrial disasters, and it seemed to ensure that the victims of the Texas City disaster would finally receive the compensation they deserved. However, the United States government was not prepared to accept this outcome, and it petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States to review the case. The government argued that the lower courts had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose and scope of the Federal Tort Claims Act and that allowing such lawsuits to proceed would interfere with the government's ability to make policy decisions and conduct foreign relations. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and oral arguments were conducted in April 1953, more than 6 years after the original disaster. The case attracted national attention as a test of the limits of government liability and the effectiveness of the legal system in providing remedies for victims of industrial disasters. On June 8, 1953, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Daylight v. United States, overturning the lower court rulings and dismissing the claims against the government. In a controversial 4-3 decision, the court ruled that the government was protected by the discretionary function exception of the Federal Tort Claims Act, which immunized the government from liability for policy decisions made by its officials. The majority opinion, written by Justice Stanley Reed, concluded that the decisions to manufacture and export ammonium nitrate fertilizer, to use specific manufacturing processes, and to regulate its transportation and storage were all discretionary functions that fell within the government's policymaking authority and were therefore exempt from tort liability under federal law. The decision was a crushing defeat for the victims and their families, who had spent years pursuing their claims through the legal system only to be told that the government could not be held accountable for its negligent actions. The ruling also established important precedent limiting government liability under the Federal Tort Claims Act, precedent that continues to influence federal tort law to this day. However, the Supreme Court's decision did not end the story of the Texas City disaster victims' quest for justice and compensation. The moral and political pressure created by the disaster and the legal proceedings was immense, and members of Congress began to receive hundreds of letters from constituents demanding that something be done to help the victims even if the courts could not provide relief. In response to this pressure, Congress eventually passed special legislation providing some financial compensation to the victims of the Texas City disaster. The Relief Act, passed in 1955, provided payments totaling approximately $17 million to victims and their families, though this amount was far less than what would have been awarded if the plaintiffs had been successful in their lawsuit. More importantly, the Texas City disaster and the legal battle that followed it led to fundamental changes in federal regulation of hazardous materials and industrial safety practices. The revelations about the inadequate safety testing and regulation of ammonium nitrate led to the development of much stricter requirements for the manufacture, transportation, and storage of dangerous chemicals. The Coast Guard developed new regulations specifically governing the handling of ammonium nitrate and other explosive materials in ports and harbors, requirements that included specialized storage facilities, enhanced fire protection systems, and strict limits on the quantities of dangerous materials that could be stored in populated areas. The Department of Transportation, which was created in the 1960s, developed comprehensive regulations governing the transportation of hazardous materials by rail, highway, and water, regulations that were directly influenced by the lessons learned from the Texas City disaster. These regulations include requirements for specialized containers, detailed labeling and documentation, emergency response procedures, and strict liability rules that make shippers and carriers financially responsible for accidents involving hazardous materials. The industrial safety standards that exist today, including requirements for safety testing, environmental impact analysis, and community notification of hazardous operations, were written in the blood of the victims of Texas City and other industrial disasters. The regulatory framework that now governs the chemical industry represents a fundamental transformation in the relationship between industrial companies, government agencies, and the communities where hazardous operations are conducted. The Texas City disaster also had a profound impact on the development of emergency management and disaster response capabilities in the United States. The inadequacy of local emergency services in dealing with such a massive disaster led to the development of mutual aid agreements between communities, improved coordination between different levels of government, and the creation of specialized emergency response teams equipped to handle chemical and industrial emergencies. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which was created in 1979, incorporates many lessons learned from the Texas City disaster and other industrial accidents into its disaster preparedness and response programs. The National Response System for Hazardous Materials Emergencies, which coordinates federal, state, and local response to chemical spills and other environmental disasters, is a direct descendant of the ad hoc response efforts that were organized after the Texas City explosions. Today, more than 75 years after the disaster, Texas City has been rebuilt and has once again become an important petrochemical center, though the modern industrial facilities are subject to safety regulations and oversight that would have been unimaginable in 1947. The port and refineries that were destroyed in the explosions have been rebuilt with modern safety systems and emergency response capabilities that reflect decades of experience and technological advancement. However, the memory of the disaster continues to influence the community and the industry that it helped to reshape. A memorial to the victims of the explosion stands near the site of the former Monsanto plant, and the Texas City Museum maintains exhibits that document the disaster and its aftermath for new generations who did not experience it firsthand. The anchor of the SS Grandcamp, which was thrown nearly 2 miles by the explosion, has been preserved as a monument to the disaster and serves as a reminder of the tremendous forces that were unleashed on that spring morning in 1947. The Anchor Memorial bears the names of 405 identified victims of the disaster, though the actual death toll was certainly higher. Educational programs in Texas City schools ensure that young people learn about the disaster and its lessons, and the story is included in the curriculum of industrial safety and emergency management programs throughout the United States. The disaster has also been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies that have helped to preserve its lessons for future generations. The legal precedent established by Dale Height v. United States continues to influence federal tort law and the limits of government liability, though subsequent legislation and court decisions have modified some aspects of the original ruling. The case remains required reading in law schools as an example of the complex relationship between legal doctrine and public policy in American jurisprudence. Perhaps most importantly, the Texas City disaster serves as a permanent reminder that industrial progress and technological advancement must be balanced against the need to protect public safety and environmental quality. The explosion that devastated a Texas port city was not an act of God or an unforeseeable accident, but the predictable result of inadequate safety practices, regulatory failures, and the prioritization of economic efficiency over human life. The fertilizer that European farmers had wanted to help rebuild their war-torn agricultural systems had instead become the instrument of destruction that claimed hundreds of American lives and changed forever the way the nation approaches industrial safety. The disaster demonstrated that the benefits of technological progress must always be weighed against the risks, and that the responsibility for protecting public safety cannot be left entirely to market forces or voluntary industry initiatives. The Texas City disaster was not just a local tragedy but a national catastrophe that helped to define the modern regulatory state and the legal framework that governs industrial activity in the United States. The explosion that lasted only seconds created consequences that continue to influence American law, public policy, and industrial practices more than 7 decades later. This was the story of the day a city exploded, a story of immense loss, heroic sacrifice, and a legal fight that changed the relationship between the American people and their government forever. It stands as a testament to the victims who died, the survivors who rebuilt their lives and their community, and the principle that industrial progress must never come at the expense of human safety and dignity. We are curious to know in the comments, is there a major industrial accident or forgotten disaster from your region's history? If you believe these stories must be told, subscribe to Don't Forget About Us and join our mission to ensure they are never lost. And don't go anywhere. Please watch our next video, already recommended for you on your screen, about another mystery that history has tried to forget.